wide territory, so this will necessarily be skeletal. Ultimately, I'm making a psychological argument that theism allows for some other agency outside the phenomenological experience of the ego. Okay, so let's start. So how theism is. Mike, got it. Okay, how's this?
Good.
Okay, how theism can help us unpack the nature of consciousness. The 21st century has seen a renewed interest in the idea of consciousness on the heels of several decades of relative neglect in the 20th century. Why the neglect? And why the revival? We might speculate on the neglect. On the surface, a trend in the sciences, and particularly psychology, exemplified by Skinner's behavioralism. The brain is a black box, and we need only to look at its output. And yet, if we dig a little deeper, we might trace this trend in part to psychological reflex. The idea of consciousness for the modern West conjures images of the soul inhabiting the body, and with it, the panoply of religious conceptions of soul and God. It is probably not surprising to find a 20th century emerging science of the mind wanting to distance itself, wanting to distance itself from an implicit theological legacy of Christian monotheism, factoring into how it is that consciousness is construed. And the revival, it may not be too far afield to suggest that, at least in part, perhaps, the recovery from the study of consciousness has come about, even if primarily indirectly, to work on the rich and nuanced parsing of non-Western philosophical models of consciousness, non-Western theisms and non-dualisms, and particularly the vibrant variation found in Indian models of consciousness, brings to the scene of the late 20th and early 21st centuries a much broader range of possibilities for thinking about consciousness, with ontologies moving beyond monotheism, with models of monisms and panpsychisms and panentheisms. This paper argues brief sketch of how one gets a multiplicity out of non-duality. I offer a bare outline here. The links between theism and non-dualism and the problem of multiplicity can only be fleetingly touched in this short span of time. Rejection of the theistic inheritance for a modern Western scientific model of consciousness was kickstarted by Descartes' seminal division of reality into two disconnected categories, res extensa and res cogitans, or by Darwin's formulation of a theory of evolution that shut the door on deist models of intelligent design. Wherever we locate the beginnings of a Western scientific model of mind, the signature of the last century of thinking about consciousness has been predominantly that the concept of mind is as something produced by the material matter of the brain, and its networks of neurons and blood vessels. This materialist perspective places the genesis of consciousness squarely within an objective third-person framework. This, the trademark of a modern science, asserts the guarantor of truth is not the authority of God or Scripture, but instead its validity hinges on the replicability of the findings via the objectivity of a third-person science. This carries with it, especially whether for political or psychological or other effects, an excision of some sort of outside power, a rejection of the idea of God, and particularly the monotheist conception of a Judeo-Christian God inherited from a Western theological lineage. Our modern science's excision of an idea of God, distancing itself from a Christian theistic past, certainly helpfully frees our models of consciousness from centuries of religious dogma, and with it as well, accompanying conceptions of mind as soul, cartoonishly named as the tiny little person, the homunculus cavorting inside the brain, as the conscious operator making our key decisions. Naturally, this simplistic image had to be abandoned. And yet, the downside of the progress achieved by departing from a theistic heritage of God and even soul has been a corollary neglect, a concomitant need to shut aside and repress also discussion of the idea of consciousness when pursuing matters of science, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. This taboo status for the topic of consciousness holds not just with the directly implicated neuroscience of the brain, even in physics as well, as David Kaiser artfully chronicles in his decision. Okay, no. Even in physics as well, as David Kaiser artfully chronicles in his decision of the history of quantum physics, the reigning victim for physicists trying to understand the meaning of the surprising impact of the scientist observer in the collapse of the wave function was simply shut up and calculate. This is perhaps nowhere better exemplified than in physicist John Wheeler's deep discomfort with bringing up the idea of consciousness in his discussion of how a quantum physics theory might incorporate the startling inclusion of the notion of consciousness. In a groundbreaking seminal article, Wheeler suggests that the basis of matter is information. And here's the slide. I'm not going to read it just to save time. In Wheeler's explanation of how we get the material world, the object comes to exist through a process of querying information, questions back and forth, exchanging information to then build up a material world. Wheeler describes the process by comparing the production of the material world from bits of information in a quantum reality to a game of 20 questions, but one where the players have not already decided on an object. Rather, the questions themselves steer the creation of the object to one specific form rather than another. In the process, he comes perilously close to underwriting the matter of our physical world with the notion of consciousness, saying, doesn't this it from bit view of existence seek to elucidate the physical world about which we know something in terms of an entity about which we know almost nothing, consciousness? Wheeler recognizes the logical implications of his theory, yet he cannot quite allow himself to follow this trajectory even as it becomes the only logical solution to a model of reality that necessarily must include the subjective choice of the human scientist in the quantum experiment. He quickly shuts down this path of reasoning, adding a few lines down. We, however, steer clear of the issues connected with consciousness. Quantum physics, as is well known, is paradigm shifting for the sciences. All apart from Einstein's misgivings about faster than light communication of particles, the spooky action at a distance entailed by entanglement. Quantum theoretical assertions regarding the role of the observer undermine the bedrock of a positivist physics. Its reliance on a third-person centered materialism dominant in our contemporary objectivist science. That its capacity to replicate results in the physical world has been demonstrated again and again, only reinforces the paradigm shifting impact the theory has, unsettling what we have come to understand as our physical world. The idea that the physical reality we encounter could be objectively measured by some outside observer. So I'm going to skip a section here talking about Philip Goff's discussion of Galileo. And I'll just give you this last sentence here. The consequent impact, Goff argues, the consequent impact of the hard problem is embedded within the structure of scientific discourse. Physicalism as a model of our world can only replicate this gap, leaving us at an inevitable dead end. Galen Strawson, on the other hand, offers a radical remedy for this problem. A committed materialist from the get-go, reluctant to let go of physicalisms, perhaps in light of the advances in science resulting from a physicalist model, Strawson opts instead to redefine physicalism. And he does so radically, literally, that is, returning to the roots of the term physicalism, reaching back into the 19th and early 20th century originary usages in the Vienna Circle, where he notes that its usage did not originally exclude the mental or the experiential. He writes, one very large irony here is that the people who introduced the word physicalism, members of the Vienna Circle, were all outright realists about experience. They were sensible people. Strawson argues that physicalism in its originary historical usages actually entailed the inclusion of mental phenomena, including experience. He offers a convincing case that historically, it has only been more recently that we find the idea of experience extracted out of the notion of physicalism. Okay, so I'm going to also read a couple of other sections here. Strawson is rather bold in how he phrases this. And certainly Strawson's position, arguing that the notion of matter in materialism and physicalism should necessarily include a notion of a first-person perspective vis-a-vis the concept of experience, is a big idea, and probably radical from a general scientific perspective. By the way, Strawson uses these two terms, experience and consciousness, mostly synonymously, while he nevertheless favors the word experience. In my opinion, he does so for a good reason, and I think for the same reason that Abhinavagupta brings in a new term, vimarsha, to account for the kind of consciousness connected to sentience, rather than the idea of consciousness as a non-dual reality, as I've pointed out at length elsewhere. The term experience, rather than the term experience, rather than the blanket term consciousness, makes apparent the notion that consciousness philosophically needs to be connected to some specific person with a first-person perspective and a particular embodied form, particularly if one wishes to solve or sidestep the mind-body problem, or the hard problem. Again, as I've argued as well in more depth elsewhere. Following from his defense of a newly redefined or recovered definition of physicalism in a gesture that revitalizes interest in consciousness in panpsychism, Strawson argues that physicalism actually entails panpsychism, that panpsychism comes out of any model of physicalism. Okay, what I will not do here, but which perhaps could be done in some other iteration of this, is to make the case that we gain some advantages from panentheism over panpsychisms. Advantages from the theistic component of Abhinavagupta's panentheism through its links to the idea of a first-person perspective, subjectivity, despite the fact that panentheism brings back in the verboten idea of theism and deity. However, I'm not entirely convinced that the theism per se is the essential element. Rather, the theism stands as a marker, a signal for agency and sentience. I argue this elsewhere where I suggest that the Indian idea of the subtle body includes the concept that there are a variety of gods inhabiting the different areas and functions of the body. The god Rudra in the palate, the god Vishnu in the throat, and so on. Okay, so I'm going to delete the section here where I talk about this. God's theism as an outside element of subjectivity and conscious intentionality, not fundamentally directed by the person's ego or mind or will. Here we see how theism paves the way for a multiplicity of limited subjects, each expressing variously the idea of a personal will. What I think in any case is crucial, following Abhinava here, is this base idea of subjectivity, and with it, the corollary of agency and freedom. This is what theism as a concept marks. Abhinava emphasizes the sine qua non of subjectivity, drawing from a verse of his grand teacher, Utpaladeva's Ajada Brahmastiti. There are no objects, no things, when subjectivity, the sense of I, is obstructed in living beings. It is well known that subjectivity, ahampava, itself is consciousness resting in itself. And that which is called resting is the lack of obstruction of all dependence. That is freedom, which is chiefly a capacity to do things, and that is the state of Ishvara, the Lord. I'm proposing that an idea of theism is tied specifically to limited subjectivity. Since I've already covered in depth elsewhere the sophisticated formulation that Abhinava uses to spell this out and to offer a solution to the hard problem, I'll direct readers there and skip this recap here. Right here, and then so I'm going to skip this whole section, and then this. Okay. Okay, as a final point here, I will very briefly sketch out how Abhinava manages to convert the kind of blanket, all-encompassing non-dualism into particular subjectivities, which he does through understanding language as evolutionary. That is, the scheme is fundamentally evolutionary. So how does Abhinava's model work? If anything, it might somewhat resemble Wheeler's description of the evolution of materiality from information. In his seminal theory of it from bit, Wheeler tells us it takes millennium of bits of information to make a physical universe, like the one we have here. These bits are continuous questions and answers on the quantum level that slowly refine and steer the shape of the reality being formed, as Wheeler says, like a game of 20 questions. Abhinava tells us a similar story. As I note above, he tells us the nature of reality itself is question and answer. An initial impulse of consciousness arises, which then goes through a process of question and answer, which entails a gradual formation of subjectivity as limited. This limited subjectivity arises out of a process whereby an originary non-dualism contracts itself, makes itself limited by hiding its innate form of freedom. Commenting on a verse in Abhinava's Tantraloka, Jayaratha explains, I'm going to skip this part, just take a little bit of time, but I'll leave it up there. I'll read a little. One might object if, in this way, indeed, in non-dualism, there is no relationship between the object and the subject, wouldn't that be the destruction of the intercourse of everyday affairs? True. There is, with regard to the highest conscious, not at all, thus even a whiff of duality. All is consciousness alone. what could go by the name of object and subject. That non-dual consciousness in this way, again, having hidden its form of its own state of freedom when it appears as a state of the nature of knowledge, which is contracted, that is the nature of the limited object and subject, setting forth this whole daily worldly reality of duality. Non-dual absolute consciousness contracts itself, makes itself limited in order to generate the diversity of forms of limited subjects and objects that we encounter here. The process begins with the absolute as goddess entering into the prana, the breath, which then moves through in stages, becoming the intellect, the physical body, and so on. This first stage of consciousness entering into the breath makes sense. Breath is connected to life. This evolves as well. This evolves as well as sound, which phenomenologically also makes sense. Breath is intimately phenomenologically tied to the articulation of sound, since the breath has as its impulse the articulation of sound as it moves out through the mouth. There's an order here tied to the evolution of the alphabet and by extension to the creation of the cosmos, the world. It is based on a very physical phenomenological experience of the breath creating the sounds of the letters and words as they move from the lungs up and through out the mouth. In the phenomenological map of the alphabet, the first sound that is uttered is the letter A, letter A. This is psychologically connected to an initial thought beginning to arise. This happens in the back of the throat. As the sound moves through with the breath, the next place of articulation is further up into the palate, and that brings us to the letter E, letter I. And then after this, closer towards the mouth, we get the letter U, U. The first impulse of breath moving out, the first impulse of breath moving out through the body, the letter A, is understood as anuttara, that for which there is nothing higher. This is tied to prakasha, the light of consciousness, understood as masculine. From out of this initial impulse comes a response. This response is the energy of vimarsha, feminine, understood as reflecting back on this initial impulse. This response, coming back to and resting in the initial letter A, creates a fiction, an answer to the initial impulse, which then lengthens it to become the letter A, the long A, understood as ananda or bliss. Abhinav says the form of the union of the two Okay. Abhinav says, form of the union of the two is known as the meeting. That, in this way, is said to be the energy of bliss, ananda, out of which this whole world is created. One can trace here layers of meanings. The physical process of the breath forming sounds, which are letters homologized to a cosmic theistic union of God and goddess, which also mirrors the human creation of new life, men and women having children. This process continues with the letter I, signifying the will, icha, arising next is the prana. The breath moves forward in the mouth with the light of consciousness, prakasha, creating the next impulse, that is the letter I. And with this, the response of the feminine energy of vimarsha generating the long I, signifying the power of sovereignty. As Andre Padu points out, the sequence of the unfolding of the alphabet is an evolutionary schema of light, prakasha, as impulse, articulating the short vowels, and then the feminine vimarsha answering these impulses to generate the long vowels. I give here just the beginning of this evolution of consciousness into materiality. It begins through the alphabet, which in turn enacts the process of the creation of the material world, charted to Abhinavagupta's inherited tattva system, which is the cosmological map of what exists in the world from rocks all the way up to minds, egos, etc. This unfolding of the alphabet is an evolutionary explication from a hierarchy of most subtle to most physical as it unfolds. I suspect that part of the reason this dialogical model was so compelling for these medieval Indians is because it relies on a phenomenological process intuitively accessible to anyone. This is a trademark of Abhinava's thinking. Everyday phenomenological images abound in his work. Phenomenology here carries the burden of validity. And I suspect this is why Abhinava spent so much time commenting on the idea of dialogue in his Paratrishika Vivadana. The back and forth of dialogue is how an absolute non-dualism contracts and limits itself through the queries, questions, and answers to become a multiplicity of limited subjectivities. Like Wheeler, these questions and answers are what then create a material world. Okay, I'm out of time.
Yeah, basically.
Okay, so, all right, so very briefly, by way of conclusion, I will steer this towards how Abhinava's model stacks up and why he frames it employing theism. Abhinava, throughout his writing, points to the non-dual absolute form of reality as undifferentiated. The lack of differentiation is, after all, what it means to be non-dual. Yet Abhinava, like Galen Strawson, and unlike idealists like Shankara, insists that we understand the world as real, physically real, with objects. For an idealist today, and Bernardo Kastrup nicely typifies this stance, all is just consciousness or mind, following Kastrup's nomenclature. And for Kastrup, as others like Federico Fagan, the lack of differentiation, this non-dualism is metaphorically, or perhaps quite earnestly understood in terms of the idea of quantum wave versus particle. So unlike the ubiquitous ocean wave metaphor we find in Indian texts, including Abhinava, a number of contemporary folks, including Kastrup, see the idea of consciousness in physics terms as the undifferentiated, uncollapsed wave. Unsurprisingly, Kastrup, an idealist like Fagan as well, suggests that the wave does not actually collapse. Abhinava, on the other hand, like Galen Strawson and John Wheeler, insists on the reality of the world contra the idealism of Vedanta, and consequently, his model will resemble John Wheeler's physicist explanation of the collapse of the quantum wave. The undifferentiated reality of absolute Shiva does collapse, and not randomly, but of its own freedom, through its own evolutionary impulse, giving us our familiar world of limited people and dogs and trees and rocks. Theism, I suggest, as the marker of freedom, swatantriya, gives us the impulse for differentiation to have a real physical world and limited subjectivities.